A watch by Gerald Genta with an estimated price range of $350,000 to $500,000. Yes, you heard that one correctly, 500,000 Freedom Eagles. Now, alas, at this year's latest Only Watch auctions, Only Watch being, of course, where the fabulously wealthy gather together to shake their jewellery in a kind of self-promoting giant money laundering exercise. No, apparently that's not correct. According to my notes here, it's a charity auction for the watch enthusiasts. So I guess I'll be seeing you all there next year. Now, at Only Watch, Genta's watch really ended up getting 170,000. So basically tea and biscuit money at this particular auction. They must have been accepting bids from the cheap seats. Now, you might be wondering why I'm talking about a watch outside the price range of anyone who actually works for a living. Well, Mrs. Saving Time wants a hand-painted watch. She loves the Disney and the old Pixar movies, you know, the ones they made before they started to ruin your childhood. And as I'm currently firmly ensconced in a doghouse this end, I've got a mind to get her one. Unfortunately, I do work for a living, so we're going to have to make one. Now, the watch you see me taking apart here in the background is what we're going to use as a base. Now, this one has been in my drawer for a few years now, and an even bigger muppet than me has at some point tried to clean this dial. It looks like mission successful, to be honest. It is pretty clean. Now, there's damage to the actual plating of this, so I assume somebody thought it was dirt and tried to remove it, and we ended up with what you can see in front of us here. Now, I need to turn this blank canvas into something a little bit special, and as I didn't want to copy anyone else's design, I enlisted the aid of one of the world's best VFX artists. Now, I'll flick through his IMDb here quickly, but basically, if you've been to the cinema in the past 20 years, you'll have come across something he's worked on. Now, he made me the concept for this watch, the sketch, and everything else to do with this watch creature, as he calls it. I call it Frank. And now I'm going to have to turn this into a watch, so really no pressure here then. But before I can do anything, I'm going to want to get a base coat on this. Now, normally I would prime with an airbrush, but I'm out of airbrush primer. So I'm going to use this car primer and then just sand it down afterwards. Obviously, a watch dial needs to have a completely flat and perfect base. The indexes will be scraped to clean them later. Of course, we won't be painting those in the final product. Now, I'm going to use an airbrush for most of this process, and I'm going to leave it to dry for at least 12 to 24 hours in between. We're eventually going to be running some masking tape on this dial to mask off certain areas, and if your paint is not perfectly dry, then you can end up with that paint peeling off, and then there'll be some tears before bedtime, and you'll have to start again, as I did on this, if I'm being honest, several times. Now, this process with the airbrush is a little more difficult than it looks to get a perfectly flat and even base coat, so I do many layers of thin paint with drying time in between. Now, once this is done, we'll move on to taking the base watch apart. I'll also cover briefly the history of the base watch that we're using, why I like it, why I think it's suitable for this, as well as who Gerald Genta was and why you might be tempted to spend $500,000 on one of his watches. So our base coat is almost done here. It's pretty flat and pretty even. If it wasn't, I would sand it down a little bit with some sort of 3000 grit, somewhere around that range, wet and dry sandpaper, and coat it again until it's perfect. As I mentioned, this process is actually quite difficult. But that moves us on to the base caliber we will be using for this watch, which is a Prim Caliber 68. It's based loosely on the ETA 1080, or it's based quite a lot on the 1080, this one having had a date complication added. For those of you that don't know, the ETA 1080 was quite a big step forward in watchmaking, adding the center second to the watch, as opposed to the small second that you may have seen on older vintage watches. It was considered kind of the first mass-produced center second. Seiko's first center second watch was based on this movement too. A lot of movements kind of copied this design, or certainly borrowed elements from it, depending on the licensing, which ETA did license this movement to a number of companies. Some were licensed, some were, how's a polite way to put it, creative recycling of design, I guess you could say. But the 1080, or the Prim Caliber 68, as we are working on here, is a great movement. Now, the Prim Caliber 68, I will start probably a comments war with this. In my opinion, is almost nicer than a lot of the 1080s out there. I've worked on a lot of ETA 1080s and a lot of caliber 68s and 66, the Prim caliber 66 being a caliber 68 with no date function. And to be fair, the Prim ones seem to be in better condition when I get them. There seems to be less breakage and they seem to be running better. Now, that's off my very small sample size, of course, so I could be wrong. But the upshot of this is if you want to work on an ETA 1080, those watches can be quite expensive. So get yourself a Prim caliber 66 if you want no date function, and a Prim caliber 68 if you want a date function. You'll have a very similar experience to working on an ETA 1080, and also you'll do it probably at a fraction of the cost. There is also a lot of watches from Prim in different design styles, so you have a lot of choice with the caliber 66 or the 68 for what kind of watch you like. Now, when I'm taking a watch apart, I always find it beneficial to throw a few screws around to show the rest of them who's boss. And this watch is coming apart no problem at all. Now, I've no idea why I removed the train of wheels bridge there before I removed the top of everything from the barrel bridge. Normally, I would not do it that way around. I guess I have my mind on a lot of other things at the moment, but it doesn't make much difference in this case. The top of the barrel bridge, the ratchet wheel coming off here, quite a nice engraved decoration on it. There is some decoration on this watch. Now, this was mass-produced like most of the watches for, I would say, the common man back in the day, but Prim went to some effort to do some decoration. There's no hand anglage on the bridges or anything you might expect to find on a more high-end watch. But it's very nice. It's well put together. As I say, I see a lot of these come across my desk, and normally they work. There's no broken parts or anything like this. Now, this screw here, I left this in. There's something on the top of this watch. This is like trying to unscrew a slip and slide. It just, screwdriver will not stay in. I think you can see the residue. Something, I believe, has been spilt into this watch at some point in its history. It's just not working at all. But our click screw comes off, and then our click and click spring come out. So if you're at all familiar with vintage center seconds, this should look very familiar to you. It's just a well put together center second watch from around 1960, late 60s, early 70s. The caliber, ETA caliber 1080 is older than this. So, you know, the Czechs were a little bit behind in their development here, but still a good movement nonetheless. And I would heartily recommend, if you are looking to get a start in vintage watches, vintage watch repair, you want to take some apart, or even if you just want something nice to wear yourself, then this caliber is probably going to be quite a good bet for you. Now, everything seems to be coming apart relatively nicely. This watch refused to tick when I got it, and it's hardly surprising when we see the level of dirt and dried on oil and various flotsam and whatever that slippery liquid was inside the watch. That's undoubtedly gummed up the works, but so far I see no actual breakages, no snap pivots, knock on wood, nothing that would render this inoperable after a good cleaning. So we'll continue to take it apart. I think I'm about to catapult this bridge, so this is not the way you want to do this. I'm just going to put this one over there, the other side of the room somewhere. No harm done in this case, but that was not the best dismount from me there. And now I can take out the escape wheel and all the rest of it. Now, the center wheel that you can see in there in the middle of the screen will be stuck on via the other side with the cannon pinion. Sliding and winding pinion come out. Now, pallet bridge comes out quite nicely. I expect that this would have been oiled for the time period, so that pallet fork is probably going to be stuck in there. Probably another reason why this wouldn't run at all. And normally we don't oil this part anymore. It's not done in modern horology. Some vintage makers did, some didn't. And again, I'm going to go back to that old adage that if you ask 5 different watchmakers how to oil a watch, you will get 8 different responses. But that was definitely gummed up, so I believe they oiled that. Center wheel won't come out, as I mentioned, because it will be fit onto the cannon pinion, which you can see there after the hour wheel comes out. Some of the date works come out, and we can really start to disassemble the keyless works now and get this whole watch ready to go into the cleaner. But so far, so good. There doesn't seem to be any major damage on a 1080. This part of the watch is often broken. I've seen a lot of 1080s with breakages in the setting jumper lever. Now, you'll have to forgive me here. I put a plastic bag or a little bit of plastic on top of this because it's sprung from underneath, and I don't want that spring getting away from me when I pull off that cover plate. And then, even though I record on 3 cameras, I managed to have just gotten a big picture of my finger there during the whole disassembly of the top of that. So I apologize for that. Apparently, if you want watch repair videos, I'm not your man. If you want finger shots, however, I have absolutely nailed it, but just really we missed the taking off of that cover plate. Nothing special to it. It is identical to the 1080, which I've done a few of on this channel, along with the Prim Caliber 66. I really like both movements. Now, the keyless works gets disassembled here, the yoke coming out. The spring on this is captive, and I can take off the cannon pinion now, and that will allow the center wheel to drop onto the table. So there we go, and we're almost done with the disassembly of this. The spring will need to come out of the barrel, being the main source of power, and everything is so oily here. You can see that's just stuck to my tweezers. This happened a lot. Half of the screws I picked up stuck to the tweezers. I don't think it's magnetism because I'm using brass tweezers. I think it literally is just dirt and oil that's causing those parts, whether they be screws or wheels, to get stuck to the tweezers. You can see a little bit of debris on my screwdriver there that's been picked up from the watch, and now I can get the spring out of the barrel. Just going to walk it side to side with my fingers, being a little bit careful of the end of it because it can jump out of there and hit you straight in the face, or worse, break your spring, which is not uncommon when getting one of these out. Bit of practice though, rarely do they jump away on me. Now I can get the barrel arbor out. So I'm going to twist it just a little bit and then pop it out. Can be a bit awkward. One of my least favorite parts of putting a watch back together is getting that arbor back in. Now, before we go into the cleaning process here, I like to give things a bit of a scrape. I'll do this on the main plate too, if it seems to need it. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of unnecessary cleaning footage, however, this video already being long enough. So the cap jewel here comes out from the shock setting, and in this case, it's going to come out in 2 pieces, one the jewel and one the chapon, which I will pull out in a moment. And there you go. That will need to be cleaned. And don't mix these up. The top and bottom jewels on this watch are a different size. So the balance also has one of these shock settings. What it does is allows a little bit of movement in the pivots for the balance. So if you drop your watch on the floor, you shouldn't snap off that hardened pivot. That's the theory. It works pretty well. And those gold things on the top just act as springs. Now, they are captive, but you can lose them. So be a bit careful. And again, the jewel and chapon are coming out. Now, as I said, they are different sizes. So you want to put those in different places, because I've assembled one of these with those the wrong way around. The watch just doesn't run very well. Now, you want to push back here to make sure that doesn't come out of its captive setting, which is obviously something I have completely failed to do. These can be a nightmare to get back in. You can tease them in with a bit of Rodico or with the tweezers if you're having a good day. But occasionally what can happen is you will be fitting that back in and there it's gone. It's disappeared. Probably never to be seen again. Those things weigh about a gram less. They get stuck on your clothes. There's not enough weight to drop them off. I do find this one, however, and get it back in. The balance also being put back in for the cleaning procedure. And here's just a look for those of you that are interested in all the stuff in the watch cleaning basket. So I'm not going to go into the whole cleaning procedure on this video because we have a whole dial to get to and a whole design process to get to, painting, airbrushing, etc. Now I'm going to show you all the process I use to create this dial, but first I'm just going to get rid of this watch creature name and give him a proper name like Frank. It looks like a Frank to me, and this is why we keep Mr. Edwards locked in the basement of the art department and don't let him name the movies. So I'll be using Inkscape here because it's free and open source, so it should be quite approachable for everyone who wants to try something like this. And I'm using a simple diode laser to cut the masking tape for this creature as well. So $150 should see you right if you want to try this yourself. And the technique can be applied, probably not to monsters in your case, but it can be applied to make sector dials. Well, you'll see as we go along. But first, I wanted to explain why I am making this monster, how somebody obviously as fabulous and charming and handsome as me ended up in the doghouse, and it's a simple language barrier. So Mrs. Saving Time ended up having to go to Sweden to look after her 101-year-old grandmother. Granny is absolutely amazing. And while she was there, her birthday happened. I was extremely busy with orders from opening up my workshop to the public. Thank you all for that. And for the slight delay some of you experienced, everyone was super nice. But anyway, during this period, Mrs. Saving Time's birthday happened, and I did not have time to make her something. Now, for the past 18 years, also, I have made something every single year, normally a piece of furniture, something out of leather, a bag, or whatnot. But this time, I had to tell Mrs. Saving Time we are flooded with orders. She'd had to go away, which was not the perfect timing for it. But, you know, Granny definitely comes first in this regard. And I just had to say, I do not have time to make you anything this year. And she said that was fine. But, you know, this being like flammable and inflammable, meaning both things set on fire, this was obviously some sort of English I didn't understand, because fine turned out to mean exactly the same as not fine, and I ended up a bit in the doghouse. So I'm undertaking this project in secret, which is why the video has taken me so long, because I have to wait until Mrs. Saving Time is out of the workshop before I can do the work on this one. So it's been a bit fragmented and a bit jumbled. I apologize. I've been away from YouTube so long. But the primary reason is basically you guys absolutely flooded our workshop. It was a bit of a cacophony of errors on my part as well. I will admit the shop was supposed to turn itself off before we got too many orders, because obviously we don't want to keep people waiting longer than necessary. But that just didn't happen, and my orders were going somehow to my Saving Time email address, which I never check because it's just flooded with people that want me to sell cat clothes or obvious gambling scams or whatnot to you guys, and I don't really want sponsorship. So we ended up in a bit of a pickle with Mrs. Saving Time having to be away, and my organizational skills, I'll be the first to admit it, are kind of useless. She normally keeps me on track in that regard, because otherwise I'll be fitting a high-powered laser into the fridge for no reason while there's a ton of other stuff to do. Anyway, Mrs. Saving Time came back from looking after Granny. Granny's fine, by the way, fortunately enough, even being like 101. She's still ticking, still doing the gardening, still going on walks. She is quite simply an amazing woman. But yeah, Mrs. Saving Time came back. A lot of you talked to her. She dealt with a lot of our email. Just to keep you guys in the loop about your orders and stuff. We are caught up again now. The shop is back online. I really want to thank everyone that ordered, which was, you know, more of you than I thought. So that was very nice. And everyone that ordered to emailed me to tell me that the shop wasn't working. It was just off for a bit, and we keep having to turn it on and off because we keep getting too many orders. But right now we are caught up with everything. So if you want something, do check out the link to my workshop and yeah, give me a shout. Now, if the shop is off, it's not broken. Again, we will have just acquired too many orders, and I hate doing this, but I also hate keeping people waiting. So you can see the general design kind of language I'm going to use here. I want bigger indexes so I can paint them. Everything will be hand painted. Hand painting dials is a thing that's been done for a long time, especially hand painted index. Companies like Frank Muller, with their crazy hours, jumping hours, they hand paint their indexes really nicely. Most high end brands will, to a certain extent, hand paint indexes, although the hand painting of stuff is sort of a dying art right now, everything being, of course, more money focused and brands wanting to get things done as quickly as possible. It's not something I like. It's not, but you know, it's a reality of the world we live in. So I wanted to try this hand painting technique. Now I know one Swiss dial expert who's going to be watching this and probably laughing at me. But, if you want to see a proper Swiss dial expert at work, I'll link a video in the description where I work with Lindsay and her workshop. She does restorations of dials for some of the biggest names in the business. She is superb at it. In fact, I believe she's in the process of literally writing the book on pad printing in the watch industry. So if you want to see a genuine expert when you watch this, because I hope you'll stick with me on this when you watch this, go down into the description. I'll link the video I did with Lindsay, and you'll see how a genuine expert does it. Now, our dial has had time to dry out, and you can see it's perfectly smooth and smooth. It's matte at the moment, which is fine. I will clear coat this with a semi-gloss, I believe I decided to go with. But of course, your mileage might vary. You can do anything. And as I said, we get a bit of masking tape on this dial, which is why it had to be perfectly dry. Now, some of the paint will probably peel off the indices when we peel that off, but that's fine. And I'm just in the laser software here now. I'm using software called Lightburn, and I'm going to burn into a bit of cardboard a marker to allow me to position the dial. Now, this is not the best way to do it. This is the Muppet way to do it. You would probably want to use a machine table, a machinist's table, to have more fine control. You can do it this way, and I hate to say it, but machinist's tables are expensive and cardboard is cheap. But I am sure I'm going to upgrade this setup and continue to make dials. I think I'll probably get myself a pad printer and a fiber laser for Christmas, depending on how everything's going, because I'd really like to delve more into dial making in general. But right now, what we want to do is hand paint a dial. And as you can see here, this kind of masking technique could be used to make dials like this Omega one on the right, which I'm sure would be of more interest to you. But Mrs. Saving Time already has a couple of those, and she wants a monster. And as I mentioned, I'm going to make her one, because apparently fine and not fine mean the same thing. Right, so I'm airbrushing a base coat on this. I will hand paint the rest of it. The point of this base coat is just to get a flat color that I like before I go in and shadow and highlight it. Now, I'm going to do quite a few coats of paint on this, but they're very, very thin coats. So you're not going to get a build-up of a kind of three-dimensional monster in the middle. It's going to be pretty flat, or at least, hopefully, it's going to be pretty flat. Now, airbrushing like this is not too difficult. I'm using a fairly cheap airbrush too. There isn't any fine line work I'm going to be doing with this. So it seems to work just fine. So again, I like to use things for these videos where you don't have to spend a fortune, because, if you have $50,000 worth of equipment set up and then I come here and I go, yeah, you can just do this. Well, obviously you can't. I see a lot of YouTube videos where the creators are like, we made this and it only cost $10, and then they bust out a $500,000 CNC and you're like, well, yeah, but no. So I like to use things that are accessible. Now, as I mentioned, I will probably get myself a fiber laser, and those are a couple of $1,000, but I want to push this a bit deeper. And I would say I think you can use these simple techniques and simple tools to create stuff that looks kind of cool. If you have a very childish missus like me, you might want to give this a go. Maybe you have kids and you want to make something with them that's not Lego, then this might be a cool project for you. It's definitely weird, on the weird side, this one, just because I'm making a monster. But as I said, there are many, many different dial designs like that Omega one that would benefit from this sort of precision masking if you wanted to paint the dial. Now, obviously, if you have a pad printer, then you would do it a different way. But I'm going to guess most of us do not have a pad printer sitting at home. And this way will get you started. It's not going to take a pull under serious magnification. Like if you put this under a microscope, it's not going to look perfect. I'm not going to be getting a call from FP Journe anytime soon, I am sure. But to create a rapid prototype of a dial, it's actually quite a nice way to do it, because a lot of the time, me especially, I'll go through a design process and then I'll get it on a dial and I don't like it. Now, if I paid a stupendous amount of money to have that dial prototyped by a professional and I don't like it, then it's going back to the professional and we're going to go all around the houses. This, for $150 worth of laser, and a bit of ingenuity is a really nice way to get a dial onto your wrist so you can get a look at it, live with it, change the design and whatnot. Now I'm putting on the hour and minute markers here with a laser. Again, these are not going to be perfectly smooth, but I think you can agree from the finished result that they are good enough unless you are, really going in with a magnifying glass, which to be fair, I would be doing if I'd have spent $170,000 on Gerald Genta's watch. But on mine, I really don't think Mrs. Saving Time is going to whip out a jeweler's loop and, take umbrage with the fact that one of the hour markers or minute markers is ever so slightly shorter than the other one. In fact, even here under this pretty heavy magnification, it looks fine in my opinion. So we are going for something that looks good to the eye and looks good to the person that receives it. Maybe doesn't look that good if you put a humongous price tag on this thing. But then again, I've seen some shockingly bad, humongously price tagged watches. So who knows? Will mine be worth 170,000 when I've finished painting it? I somehow seriously doubt it, but if somebody wants to make me an offer, I will go back into the doghouse and take your $170,000. Right, now comes the hand painting, because obviously the whole purpose of this is to hand paint it. Mrs. Saving Time wants something unique. She wants something that I put a lot of time and effort into, and this is it. So at the moment, you can see our black going on. Our paint in general will go on with what looks like not much coverage, because these are very thin layers, and I will just do them over and over again until they are flat. You do not want to put on a very thick layer of paint. I am also using a acrylic flow improver in the paint so it stays wet for longer, because if you try this without it, it's more difficult. The paint will dry out and then you'll end up moving dry paint around, which just creates kind of chalky look and effect of very obvious brush strokes. So I would recommend, if you are going to try this kind of tiny miniature painting, you pick up a flow improver for your paint. I'm using acrylic paint, by the way, Vallejo game paint, I believe it is. It's a good acrylic paint. It is quite expensive, but it's not like you're painting a house. You don't need much of it. So I would recommend a very high quality paint and a very good flow improver. I'll try and link some down below, not affiliate links or anything, just to be helpful. Now, I want to try this as well at some point in enamel. So the proper enamel technique where you bake it in a kiln. The problem is you'd need to start with a solid gold dial. There are some companies, I believe, that are working now with a copper alloy for enameling, but I think that's proprietary material and the chances of me being able to get it are non-existent. So I would have to work with a solid gold dial base, and obviously solid gold's not exactly falling off trees at the moment. So I'm continuing to paint this with some highlights here. Again, very thin paint, lots and lots of passes on the highlights. And you can see we start to bring some life to our character. Now, it will be put back in the laser when this is finished to get the line work more pronounced, I guess you could say. So right now we are just doing a lot of highlighting and detail adding and that sort of thing. Now, I could have pushed this one a lot further, got a bit of a nicer result, but this takes quite a long time. And as I said, I was having to do this with Mrs. Saving Time out of the workshop because I wanted this one to be a surprise. So I did have a fairly limited amount of time to spend with this, unfortunately. I think the end result, which you'll see as we go through, came out great. I will show you, of course, pictures at the end and you can see it as we go through, but I think it worked really, really well for what it is. I've seen a lot of painted dials. Used to be more popular than it is, of course, because of the expense of it nowadays and the inability to mass produce. It's kind of a rarity, and a lot of high-end watch brands would go with an enamel dial just because of the extra expense that adds. I don't think I've ever seen an enamel dialed watch, one with a design painted on it for less than $5,000, and that would be at the bottom end of the price range, I believe. So you're looking at some seriously expensive things when you get into that. I'd love to get into that. It's going to be expensive. I'm not going to split any hairs. It's going to require a gold dial base, a kiln, and a bunch of other stuff. And for right now, this technique seems to be working fairly well. It's definitely something that has been done to dials in the past, although, as I said, it is rare, and I'm quite liking the look of old Frank here as we go along. Hopefully this one will get me out of the doghouse. You never know your luck, right? But I think Mrs. Saving Time is going to love this. It's an original sketch, an original concept from an artist that works on some of the movies that she really likes. So, give me your thoughts in the comments. Give me time to finish this off, though. And yeah, hopefully this will do the trick. So a couple of little finishing details to do here yet. We've also got to paint the indexes. Now, I did consider painting those in luminous paint, so they would glow in the dark, of course, but I'm not sure if I want to use luminous hands with this one. This one's acting more like a prototype than a finished product. I'm going to give it to Mrs. Saving Time. If she loves it, I'll probably rebuild it with a Solita movement or something. Maybe do something a little different with it. So I'm just going to paint with non-luminous paint for now, and that might change in the future. Also, with these eyes, I wanted to get them looking off in a direction rather than staring straight into your soul every time you looked at your watch. And I'm going to fast forward the index painting a bit. I don't think anyone wants to watch me paint every single index on this, but it's the same procedure I'm using, very thin paint. Now, I've also gone ahead and put the artist's signature on the dial there, and I'm going to do a coat of varnish here just to protect this so I can touch it, pick it up. Basically, it's pretty fragile as it is now, so I'm using a kind of rock hard clear coat on this satin finish, which will protect the dial. Now, on older watch dials, most of the time the base coat was put on and then the varnish and then the printing would be done on top. This was so if the printer got it wrong or the hour markers were slightly out of alignment, minute markers, what have you, they could be wiped off that protective coat of varnish. Now then another protective coat of shellac or varnish might have been put on top of that, but for this purpose, we are just going there with one protective coat of varnish on top of everything. Now that varnish is still wet, so it's still a bit sparklier than it will turn out, but we'll see what that looks like towards the end. There's also a bit of cleanup to be done around the date window and various other little odds and sods that need a bit of a tidy, but really I am genuinely pleased with how that came out. I think it's just the kind of thing that will be loved by Mrs. Saving Time. We can only hope. I am out of the doghouse and can go back to fitting high-powered lasers into the fridge. Right, so I'm going to wind the mainspring. We need to get this watch back together here. And at the end of the wind, I'm going to push this in with a pair of tweezers. Now, it's off camera because I managed to get my head right in the way of the camera, but don't let that snap back in. These winders, by the way, are vintage, probably circa 1950, 1960. Get a set of 8 of them in different sizes on eBay for around 100, 150 euros. I would recommend them for dealing with vintage watches. I have a set of the Chinese ones that are popular on websites like AliExpress. Never use them. These are just so much better. Every job I've found with a vintage watch, that I don't think I've ever got the Chinese ones out of the box other than to test them. You can't find a set of these. I couldn't tell you if the Chinese ones were good or not. Like I say, I don't really use them, have had no need for them since I bought them, really. Now, also another bit of excellent camera work here from me, getting the barrel arbor in. It managed to get my finger right in front of every single part of the shot. But basically, you're just pushing the barrel arbor into the spring there. Make sure you have that arbor hook engaged with the end of the spring. Like so. I mean, it's not rocket science. It can be a pain in the backside, and often it's one of my least favorite parts of getting a watch together, but this one went in relatively easily. In fact, this whole watch has been nice and easy to take apart, easy to clean, hopefully easy to get back together. We don't know quite yet if it's going to be working or not, but knock on wood, we'll be fine. So while I'm putting this back together in the background of the video here, I'd like to cover just a brief history of Prym and who Gerald Genta is for those of you that don't know. Now, watch production in this part of the world, in Bohemia, Goes back to the 19th century, but it was with the establishment of the Chronoteka plant in 1949 that industrial production began here in what was then Czechoslovakia. The first watch prototype came out in 1954 under the brand name Spartek, and if you can find one of those, they're redonkulously expensive. Before the Prim brand was established, which was done in 1958. Now, to date, Prim have produced over 16 million watches. Now, between 1949 and 1989, Prim held a monopoly on all watches produced in Czechoslovakia, made for both the army and ordinary civilians. In 1969, the Chronoteka plant became independent from the parent company and started using the name Elton. The Prim brand and Elton were privatized separately in the wake of the Velvet Revolution, and this has led to extensive litigation between the two brands. Basically, all you need to know is now there are two Prim brands, one that produces mechanical watches and one that focuses more on a lower-end quartz. But I would, of course, recommend the older vintage style. Now, Prims are somewhat of a cultural icon around here. They are given as official gifts to foreign visitors, government visitors and whatnot, from the office of the president, and among the recipients have been Barack Obama, Angela Merkel, and Nicolas Sarkozy. Now, this is a genuine miracle here. The train of wheels bridge just slotted right on first try. You hardly ever see it. All three pivots came through. Absolutely superb. Couldn't be happier, really. That was the easiest train of wheels bridge I think I've ever had to fit. It just literally dropped on there. Now, I do go further into depth on Prim on some of my other videos, so check out my channel if you want to know more, but that's the long and short of it. They are the national watchmaker for the Czech Republic, or at least they used to be. Now, as to Gerald Genta and why having his name on a Mickey Mouse watch makes it worth so much money, well, it's basically that Genta created two of the most famous watches to have ever existed. The Patek Philippe Nautilus and the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. Now, Genta himself had a passion for Mickey Mouse watches. For some reason, he started in the 1980s to create enamel dialed Mickey Mouse watches out of gold and platinum that sold for tens of thousands of dollars. Now, he also did a collaboration with Hublot for good or bad. He did bring the brand back from the brink of bankruptcy with this collaboration. It's a genuinely an impressive feat. So why you pay a lot of money for Genta's watch is you're buying from the watchmaker that created two of the world's most iconic watch designs in the Nautilus and the Royal Oak. Now, Genta's famous for a lot more than this. In fact, Christie's auction house in New York called him the Fabergé of watchmakers. He's had an astounding career. Now, the watch you saw, the minute repeater for the Only Watch auction, which was commissioned for Disney's 100th anniversary, also was made by one of his apprentices, somebody he taught. Genta himself unfortunately passed away in 2011, and I'd have to make several videos, I should think, to cover Genta's career. But that's a little bit of the look of why people are prepared to pay so much money for a watch with the name Gerald Genta on it, if you didn't know. Our watch here is going back together just superbly. The train of wheels bridge, as I said, dropped on with fewer problems than I've ever seen. And we're going to get the barrel bridge rebuilt here now. Ratchet wheel has gone on, click and click spring have gone on. And I'm just putting a little bit of oil here for the crown wheel. Now, that crown wheel spacer never actually came off the watch. I've found in this particular caliber, the crown wheel spacer is sort of compression fit, press fit on really tightly, and I do not see the point in taking that off. You need a pair of pliers and give it a good yank, and the reward is not worth the risk in this case. So I'm just going to leave that on. It shouldn't really affect the accurate running of this watch, and I do expect this to be fairly accurate when we get it back together if it ticks. Anyhow, I'm going to move over to the dial side of the watch now where the keyless works live, and in this case the date works. Press on the cannon pinion first. Because this is press fit, if you've got that hour wheel, or in this case a part of the date works next to it, you can end up press fitting that down and snapping one of the teeth off one of the other wheels. So I like to get that in first. If you've forgotten it, as you've probably seen me do in a few videos, you really want to come back and remove any wheel around it just to mitigate the possibility that you'll end up snapping some teeth off something. So DateWorks going back in now. Very simple DateWorks on this watch. Nice and easy to put back together, which is sort of a theme with this one. Now I think I'm going to dump a little bit too much oil in there. I am indeed. So a bit of Rodico just used to clean that up a bit. So you don't necessarily want a lot of extra oil hanging around. Well, no necessarily about it. You don't want it. Now this hour wheel here is actually fit. It's sort of a compression fit, a bit like the Canon Pinion. So I don't really understand why they had a dial washer on it, a dial spacer. Doesn't make any sense because it can't move up or down. Maybe I'm missing something there. Let me know in the comments, but this is not like your bog standard hour wheel that can move. So really, I don't see the point of a dial spacer. So all the DateWorks going back in, lovely to put together. This date function or date complication also has a very nice snap to it. Unlike some that move around rather slowly, this one does snap the watch over onto that next date. Looks kind of nice. I don't really like a date wheel to be sort of half set and half not. Now, Keyless Works being rebuilt, I believe I say this every time I do a video, but for those of you who are new, it's called the Keyless Works because watches used to be wound and set with a key, possibly even two keys when you had a pocket watch, or if you have like a carriage clock or a grandfather clock in your house, or you did as a kid, you might remember winding that up with a key. Well, the Keyless Works solves the problem of you having to carry a key around in your pocket to wind and set your watch. Basically, it allows it to be done via the crown and winding stem, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with. Now this one based on the 1080, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, so it fits together just fine. Not really expecting any surprises here. I'm going to put some extra dots of oil around here, or grease in this case, for the heavy metal on metal contact, which probably aren't going to be shown. But again, I've only got a limited amount of time in this video and with you guys here, so I am trying to keep this as interesting as possible without necessarily covering every single minute bit. Now, a little bit of grease around where the yoke will go. That captive spring, a very nice addition. I very much like that. It saves you sending parts to join the Swiss space program. As I have done many times in the past, it's just a very nice thing. I really like the addition of the captive spring as opposed to the one that is normally used on a lot of designs. Again, I'm just dotting around a little bit of grease where there would be heavy metal on metal contact. You don't want that grinding against each other. That will cause a lot of wear to your base plate and everything else. Now I'm going to get the cover plate back on, which also contains the setting jumper. This in our 1080 is broken a lot of the time. Now I don't know if it's because the material that we used on the 1080s I've seen, or maybe the setting lever spring was a little bit thinner than this one, but it's a common complaint that I've seen from other watchmakers too. So, you know, is this one better? I've no idea, but I rarely see it broken. So you can see that snapping backwards forwards quite nicely. Now I need to clean the cap jewels for the ink block setting, for the shock setting that goes into this watch. So I'm using a little bit of leather on a stick, and I'm just going to rub that backwards and forwards. This has also been cleaned as well beforehand, the rubbing backwards and forwards, just to make sure that I get a nice mirror finish on it and there is no possibility of any extra oil. But oil that, put the chaton back on, and then you can drop that into the watch. Now, again, these shock springs can be a little tricky. I must admit I was a little daunted the first time I did one of these. And the ones on this watch are fairly recessed into the main plates. They're actually a little more difficult than a lot. They look exactly the same, but that extra depth that they have that you need to get them in does create a few problems. Bit of practice, however, it's not really that much of a problem. Now, I'm going to oil all the jewels on this, but you're not going to see this very well. I would normally do this under a microscope. However, my microscope has been playing a bit of the silly buggers recently, so I'm having trouble getting footage out of it. Now, for the plate that covers the DateWorks, you might see I have put spring in the plate before I mount it. This is a step that's pretty easy to overlook. If you do, your date works, they're just not going to snap round. And, don't forget, basically. So if I've convinced you to try and rebuild one of these, or if you were thinking about trying one, just remember the spring under the plate. I've forgotten it several times. There you can see I'm just going to push it into place. Now that first initial screw I put in, I only screwed down a couple of twists. It just allows the plate to stay there while I get the date ring back and that spring in. And after you've done that, you'll be able to push it down a lot more and get everything settled in place before you tighten up that second screw. So we're back on the non-dial side of the watch now, on the back of the watch. And we're going to fit our pallet fork here and then our pallet bridge. So we don't actually oil the top of the jewel on this anymore. Now, this used to be done, and I have in my comments section before and by talking to other watchmakers, I think most people agree that that jewel should not be oiled because the pallet fork doesn't turn at 360. It just oscillates backwards and forwards. So the general consensus now seems to be don't oil that. Back in the day, I've seen old watch books that say to, but really I don't anymore because that seems to be the general consensus. And when I put the balance in, it has a very, very weak tick up. However, this is a very good sign. There is no jewel in the top of the ink block setting there. So you would expect it, and it isn't screwed down. So I hope when I screw this down and start to tighten it, you'll see that oscillation pick up in frequency, in amplitude. And there you go. Even without the jewel in, that looks pretty good. I was genuinely happy to see that. This watch was not ticking at all, of course, when we got it. And you can see that pivot bouncing around in there. We'll definitely need its jewel fitted. Now, some of the plating is missing on this, and it looks like there's some file marks on the edge of the balance. I have no idea what that's about. This watch is 50 years old at least, so it will have taken a few knocks in its lifetime. But these old prims are built somewhat tank-like. Now, I'm going to make sure I push backwards slightly when I fit this in. This not pushing backwards was how I lost it in the first place, but there you go. If you concentrate a minute and just take your time like I did here, you can see that snaps rather nicely. And here's the date window snapping. So what I'm doing is I'm using the quick set date function. I'm just winding the hour hand forward an hour and then winding backwards, and it snaps the day over quite beautifully. Now I'm going to get the dial on. I'm going to speed run through putting this watch back together just because of the amount of time we've already spent together. But the dial goes on no problem. Now it's just a case of press fit in the hands. I'm sure you've all seen me do this, a few times if you are a frequent viewer. And if not, if you genuinely want to see hands pressed on, please see just about any other video. But once the hands are pressed on, I have to check that everything is working nicely, that the hands don't bump into each other or anything. And of course, I want to check when the date flips over. So it should be pretty near midnight, of course. So you can see it start to go by about 1/4 and by about 5 to it's snapped over. That's close enough for me on this. I shall be changing these hands anyway. They're a pair of old hands that I found in the drawer. Not sure if I like them. I'll have to live with them. Get the second hand on. And again, the procedure is the same. I'm going to get that second hand on. I'm going to test the hands go round again and just make sure that everything is sitting nicely before I get this back in the case. So I hope you all enjoyed this look, a rather more light-hearted look at dial creation. I find nowadays watches have become so expensive and so serious. Everything is very traditional and very price motivated. And I wanted to create something truly unique that I thought Mrs. Saving Time would love. Now, I'm going to design and make a strap for this over on my other channel, Wasting Time, because I think this video is long enough. So I'm going to let Mrs. Saving Time pick out the leather for that after I give her the watch. I will also have to fix the crown and winding stem on this, which is a bit wonky. So that will need a bit of a fix. So if you want to see this watch on wrist, on Mrs. Saving Time's wrist in this case, head over to my other channel where I'll have that video up in a few days. Now, I really enjoyed, as I said, this lighter-hearted look at watchmaking. Hopefully you did too, and you'll see the utility in techniques like this for rapid dial prototyping, if nothing else. And before I go, I want to bung this on a time grapher for you. Now, what I've started to do with my time grapher, which if you don't know is an instrument for measuring the accuracy of a mechanical watch, is I've started to put watches on there right at the end of their cycle. I find this shows up a lot more errors, and right at the end of the cycle, you're looking for an amplitude of around 220 would be perfect. Now, this is about to run out of power, so this is the worst it's ever going to be. And as you can see, it's keeping fantastic time. At the top end of its power cycle, it's around 280, 290 in amplitude, which is pretty good for a watch that's old, especially considering we didn't replace the mainspring, the power source of the watch. That B error at zero point 0.3 milliseconds is zero point 0.1 at the top of its cycle. Now, this does deviate a little bit, I would say, probably over all positions. It's about half a minute a day, fast or slow, but still as good as a modern lower end Seiko movement. So, you know what? I'll take it. And the point of this watch was obviously not to keep fantastic time. Now, my workshop is open again. I really want to thank everyone that bought a strap from me. It was fantastic to speak to you all. It will be open. I don't know how long. I'll leave the link in the description. Lovely to talk to you all. Thanks for watching.